I think that we are ready to go. There's still a few more people who are coming into the room, but we'll give them a few extra minutes while I'm greeting you all. My name is Corey Collane. I am the Executive Director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming you not to our beautiful space, our physical space in the Fisher Fine Arts Library on Penn's campus, but to our virtual space for our panel Towards Clean Equity, Energy Equity, Overcoming Racial Disparities, which is actually the first event in our public lecture series for the academic year. So welcome. I just want to make a few notes before I introduce our panelists and get myself out of the way. So the first is that this event is one of several that the center has sponsored this week that's part of Penn's Climate Week. You can see, I think on the next slide, there is a link that will take you to a website if you're interested in attending any of the additional events that are later on this afternoon or tomorrow, including one more that we are sponsoring tomorrow at 11 o'clock that you'll see there. A case for carbon removal from the air. And that is with our newest faculty hire, Jennifer Wilcox, who is the Presidential Distinguished Professor of Chemical Engineering and Energy Policy. She has one of the longest titles that we've ever had. And her PhD student, Noah McQueen, and they are going to be in conversation with the Kleinman Center Faculty Director, Mark Hughes. So that's tomorrow at 11. You can register online by following that website. But moving to the reason that you are here with us today, I have the pleasure of announcing our panelists. So we'll start with Sarah Bronin. So Sarah is the Thomas F. Gallivan Chair in Real Property Law and the Faculty Director of the Center for Energy and Environmental Law at the University of Connecticut. This academic year, I will also mention that Sarah is with us at the Kleinman Center as a virtual visiting scholar. So we've had to change our programming up a little bit to accommodate the restrictions and constraints of the pandemic. But Sarah will be with us virtually. So for any of you who are interested in meeting with her, she's doing a podcast with us in addition to moderating this event today. She's writing a policy digest and she will be in and out for the entire academic year. So thanks, Sarah. Then we have Deborah Sunter, who is assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Tufts University. Hi, Deborah. And then we have Emily Schapira, who is homegrown at Penn. She has a Wharton MBA, and she is currently the executive director and board member of the Philadelphia Energy Authority in our home city. We thought that Emily was going to be a few minutes late. We're delighted that she is here. She today, just now, was an awardee and was at an award ceremony for Philadelphia's 40 Under 40. So congratulations, Emily, and thanks for skidding in here after what sounds like it was a pretty fun event. And then last but not least, we have Jason Carney, who is the founder and CEO of Energy Electives and the president of the Tennessee Solar Energy Association. So I'm going to hand it over now to Sarah, who's going to set a few ground rules for the event and tell you how we're going to proceed. And I just want to thank you all for being here.
Thanks so much, Corey. And on behalf of the Kleinman Center, welcome again to our panel today. I hope you are just as excited to hear from our panelists as I am. As you listen to them today, I would encourage you to think about neighborhoods and communities within your region that suffer from energy inequality, that suffer from energy insecurity and energy inefficiency. Today, I know I'll be thinking about Hartford, Connecticut, where I'm beaming in from. Our city has an 85% Black, Indigenous, people of color population. It's one of the lowest income cities in the country. And we have a homeownership rate of just 23%. Unfortunately for Hartford, we've seen our fair share of environmental injustice. We have a landfill, a trash to energy plant, a sewage treatment facility within our 17 square miles. And we've tried really hard to try to turn some of these things around. We've done zoning reforms. We've erected a public-private microgrid. We've advocated at the state level. We've capped and solarized that landfill, and we've started Solar for All programs. But one of the things that we found here is that none of that has been enough. Too many of our residents are still energy insecure. They pay enormous amounts of their incomes on energy costs. And because they are poor, because they live in multi-unit housing, because of just circumstance, they simply cannot access the clean energy economy. So today we're actually going to hear how widespread this kind of problem is across the country. We'll hear about policies that prevent us from achieving clean energy equity, and we'll hear about some possible solutions and bright points, and we'll focus primarily on solar. And I have to say that I think a lot of us need some bright points today, and I hope we hear a lot of them. As we all know, racism is not constrained to the question of access to clean energy. It's all around us, and it's all interconnected, just like we're all interconnected. So with that as a framing, and also the hope that we can all be part of the solution, let's turn now to the panel. We do have a Q&A. I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A, and I will very gladly field them. First up, and Deborah, please go ahead and start sharing your screen if you can. First up is Deborah Sunter. So you heard an introduction from Corey about her, and she's going to show us a really interesting project that she did surveying national data on clean energy use. So Deborah, please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Excellent. So I'm happy to share with you a bit about a study I did looking at the disparities in rooftop solar deployment in the United States by race and ethnicity. And so let me give a little bit of background about what motivated me to do this study. So there's been a lot of criticism historically around solar and household income. So you'll see headlines such as, is US residential solar just for the rich? Is rooftop solar just a toy for the wealthy? Solar subsidies make money from the poor to help the rich. So what's going on here? Essentially, traditional methods for purchasing rooftop solar had to do with very high costs, and systems could cost tens of thousands of dollars, making it unavailable to low and moderate income households. And there's been quite a lot of emphasis around making solar more accessible to these communities through innovative financing and specific policies and incentives to target those communities. However, I wonder if there might be another demographic community that may also be left out or missing out of this from this solar revolution. And part of the reason I suspect this might be happening is that there's a long history of environmental racism. So there was a study done in the 90s that actually showed that communities of color are more heavily targeted for hazardous waste landfills than poor communities. And so that asks the question, is there also energy racism? And also there's quite a bit of history around this as well. Even today, nearly 70% of all African Americans living in the United States live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. And the reason that a 30-mile radius is particularly important is that in that close proximity, that's when the health effects are most detrimental. And so some people look at solar with a lot of hope, since it doesn't create pollution at the site of energy generation, unlike coal-fired plants. However, I think it's important when we look at racial disparities that they can come in many different ways. So there could be racial disparities in the case of a coal-fired plant, where communities are, certain demographic communities are disproportionately suffering from the negative effects of energy, such as pollution. But in this case of solar, you could find communities that are disproportionately missing out on benefits. And rooftop solar comes with it many benefits, such as lower cost electricity, rebates, incentives, tax credits, and a variety of other different financial benefits. So for this project, I partnered with Google Project Sunroof, where I've been a trusted tester for a couple of years. This project uses aerial images, and knowing where the plane has flown at what time of day, you can recast where the shadows are to render those 2D images into 3 dimensions. And that's particularly important because it's important to realize that not all roofs are appropriate for rooftop solar. So in the image there, you can see that if you have a large tree next to your house, that may mean that certain times of the day, your roof is in a shadow and therefore not as appropriate for rooftop solar. So with Google Project Sunroof, essentially what we're able to do is we're able to identify which roofs have solar on them already. And then for those that do not have solar, how many of them are solar viable in that they could support solar. So they're not in the shadow of a neighboring tree or a large building or something like that. And so here I provide the link for the Google Project Sunroof, and I encourage you all to go and you can enter in your own address and then learn about what the potential emission savings are and economic benefits of putting solar onto your personal roof. But you can also look at Google Project Sunroof in aggregate in various regions. So Tufts University is in Medford, Mass. And so I did it for the city of Medford. And here you can see that there's 160 existing rooftop solar installations. And those without, 84% of them are solar viable. Because of this study, I want to study disparities in race and ethnicity. I had to use data from the American Community Survey. And so I got data regarding race and ethnicity for Asian, Black, Hispanic, and whites. And I looked at census tracts, which essentially is the resolution of a neighborhood. And when 50% or more of the population within that neighborhood identified as the same race or ethnicity, the census tract would be classified as that race or ethnicity. When there was no single race or ethnicity that made up 50% of the community, that census tract would be classified as diverse or having no majority. In addition to getting racial and ethnic demographic information, I also got median household income and the percent of households occupied by renters. So the reason for the median household income is clear from the media that I shared earlier, that because there's been a lot of criticism around low and moderate income communities missing out on solar. And the reason for the percentage of household occupied renters has to do with the split incentive problem. So landlords, they would take on all the risks of paying the upfront costs of putting on rooftop solar. However, the benefits of that, which would be lower cost electricity, are reaped by the tenants. And since one party is taking on the risk and a different party is reaping the benefits, households that are occupied by renters are much less likely to put on rooftop solar. So now I want to move into how the analysis was done. So just because a community doesn't have rooftop solar doesn't mean that it's been disadvantaged. It's very important to recognize that you could have a community that's perhaps in a very wooded area or have surrounded by tall buildings in which there are not as many roofs that could support solar. So the first normalization I did was I looked at how many roofs have rooftop solar relative to how many roofs could support rooftop solar, the solar viable rooftops. And now for Google Project Sunroof, it has 60 million buildings that are analyzed in all 50 states. And those are shown in yellow in the map. And it's important to recognize when we're doing this national study that states do vary quite a bit between one another. They vary in their available solar resources, their incentive programs and policies, as well as their electricity prices. And all of these will affect how financially beneficial rooftop solar is and how likely it is that people would participate. Now here I show the results. Let's first start with plot B. So along the x-axis, I'm showing median household income. And on the y-axis, it's the state normalized solar deployment. So as expected, based on all the criticism from the media, you can see that higher income communities are installing more rooftop solar. And now the different colors represent different racial majorities for the census tracts. And I want to point out that the green, these are the no majority or diverse census tracts where 50% of the community did not self-identify as the same race or ethnicity. So in plot C, what I've done is I've normalized plot B by those diverse census tracts. And here the disparity becomes much more apparent. And you can see that the Black and Hispanic majority census tracts shown in gray and red are below those no majority census tracts by 69 and 30% on average. In contrast, the white majority census tracts shown in blue are installing more rooftop solar by on average 21%. So the solid line in these curves is the result of using the lowest method, which is a locally weighted scatter plot smoothing. And the shaded area represents the 90% confidence interval. So one way for you to interpret this is that when the 90% confidence intervals are not overlapping, that shows that we're 90% confident that there's a statistical significance and there's an evidence of disparity. And from these plots, it's very clear that such a disparity does exist. Now, a similar analysis was done to also take into account the home ownership challenges, which I mentioned earlier with the split incentive. So along the x-axis now we have the percent of households occupied by renters. And in plot B, as expected, as you have a larger percentage of the households being occupied by renters, there's less rooftop solar deployments. And in C, when we normalize by the diverse census tracts, the no majority ones shown in green, we see a very similar racial disparity emerge, where Black and Hispanic majority census tracts are disadvantaged by 61 and 45%, while white majority census tracts are advantaged by 37%. And so at this point, my hypothesis has been answered. I wanted to know whether or not there was evidence of racial injustice, racial disparities in rooftop solar, and there clearly is statistically significant evidence to point to that. The next question, which is a much more complicated and elaborate question, is to understand the causes or why. And now it's important to recognize that the Google Project Sunroof, you simply get a snapshot of the situation at a given point of time. It doesn't show the evolution of the solar landscape. However, one hypothesis that I have is that this disparity is linked to the seeding process. Now, what a seed installation is the first installation within a neighborhood. And solar, because it's exterior to your house, in some ways serves as a billboard. And so not only is that like apparent marketing for solar, but you also have word of mouth, and people who are enjoying a product are more likely to talk to others and get them also interested in installing rooftop solar. And so looking at the census tracts that have that were included in the Google Project Sunroof analysis, a pretty stark realization was made. And you can see that Black majority census tracts, nearly half of all census tracts studied, did not have a single rooftop solar installation. So they have not yet been seeded. And this is nearly twice that of all other race and ethnicities. And now, while Hispanic communities were shown in the previous plots as being quite disadvantaged, they've been seated at a relatively similar level as the other race and ethnicities. However, this may point to the fact that perhaps Hispanic communities have been seeded later and that the spreading effects haven't had enough time to take hold. However, in order to do that, time series data would have been necessary. And so at this point, I want to kind of zoom out a little bit, because some people can read my study and come across feeling quite defeated, like, this is yet another example of systemic racism. However, I think it's really important to recognize that identifying a problem is the first step towards fixing it. And I think that this problem has in many ways gone unnoticed because there's been so much emphasis on income disparity that they haven't looked at other demographic disparities. And all challenges represent opportunities from a diverse group of sectors. So within industry, this analysis has basically shown that there's a market gap. And now those companies can now work towards finding customers within that gap. Within the government, there's been quite a lot of policy interventions aimed at making rooftop solar more inclusive, specifically for low and moderate income communities. And this points to the possibility of having similar tailored policy interventions. And then as an academic, speaking at an academic event, I think it's really important to also recognize that there's a huge opportunity for academics to also make a contribution here. So the paper that I wrote is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so many unanswered questions that still remain. And many of these are trying to understand the root causes. And for that, you could need time series data and specific knowledge of regions, talking to people who could potentially install solar and understanding their choice process, why they decided to or not to install solar. You can also look at different policies that have been used and whether or not those have exacerbated this racial disparity or mitigated it. And so there's a lot of work to be done, and I hope that you will join me in trying to better understand this problem so that we can all work together towards a solution. So in conclusion, I just want to say that recognizing the problem is the first step towards fixing it, and I'm really excited to work towards fixing it with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was great. You'll see a couple of questions in the Q&A that might be specific to your presentation, including a citation request. So I'll let you check that out. And Emily, if you'd like to share your screen. There is one question while you're sharing your screen for Deborah that might be relevant, which is, what about household wealth? So you talked a bit about income, but isn't household wealth also potentially a factor? And were you able to take that out and analyze that in your data?
Yes, that's actually a great question. So in the supplemental material for my paper, we actually do look at surplus income, which in some ways does hit on wealth. Because when you look at a national study, the cost of living varies a lot place to place. And so what we wanted to do is look at what your household income is and then subtract out what the average cost of living is for that county, and then repeat the analysis. And for that, we found the very comparable results. The same disparities still persisted throughout. But excellent question.
Great. And I know you'll have a few more when we do the Q&A at the end. So, so please keep your questions coming. With that, I'm going to introduce Emily Schapira. You heard about her already. She's going to talk about some of these issues as she's seen them unfold in Pennsylvania and more specifically in Philadelphia, one of our great large cities on the East Coast. So Emily, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And thanks, Deborah. We use your research all the time, so we're really excited about it and really appreciate the work you're doing. Well, thanks everybody for having me. I have to admit that I had a bit of reticence as a white woman joining this panel and thinking about, what's the role of white people in this conversation. And I heard yesterday at a conference, two of my total heroes, Carolyn Green from Green Capital Management and Darlene Phillips from PJM, two Black women executives talking about how over the course of the last however many months this has been, that we've been really experiencing civil unrest and just the level of outrage and frustration about what's going on in this country, that their workload has increased exponentially because everybody's asking them to be a part of the diversity and inclusion conversations that they're having at their companies and that they are tired. And so they really made an appeal yesterday for white allies to really join the conversation and not be afraid to take a leadership role. So it gave me a bit of reassurance, and I'm really glad to be here today because this intertwines with our work in a very fundamental way. And I think I would be remiss to just not mention the sort of pain and frustration that folks are feeling today in light of the grand jury results yesterday from the Breonna Taylor case. So with that context, I think we can talk a little more about what we're doing here in Philadelphia. Sorry, learn how to click ahead. So here's what I'll share today. A little bit of context on Philadelphia and our organization, the Philadelphia Energy Authority. And I'll talk about two programs, our solar training program, Bright Solar Futures, and our housing restoration program, Built to Last. And then if we have time, an idea about how we can move forward as we've been pitching it to industry. So let's start with this. People hate this moniker, but I use it anyway because I think it paints a good picture. Philadelphia is the poorest big city in America. If you look at all of the big cities, our poverty rate has been the highest and persistently highest for decades. And so pre-COVID, 25% of Philadelphians live below the poverty line, and that includes more than 1 in 3 children. Post-COVID, during COVID, I think we're in an even more difficult position. We consistently are in non-attainment for the Clean Air Act, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. And we have the 4th highest rate of asthma in the US. There are 2 stats that we normally look at to determine how difficult things are energy-wise for folks in our region. And those are energy burden and energy insecurity. So in Philadelphia, residents below 30% of area median income, that's our poorest tranche of the population, pay 23% of their income to utilities. The average household in the US is paying something more like 3 to 5%. So think about that as you're thinking about your own budget and what that would mean to have to set aside 23%. The other metric is energy insecurity. It's a term of art, means foregoing food or medicine to pay for your utilities, setting your home to an unsafe or unhealthy temperature, or that you're at risk of a utility shutoff. And the stats are pretty staggering for Philadelphia. Over half of African-American head of households at any income level, and over 40% of all renters at any income level face energy insecurity at least once a year in Philadelphia. So we know this is a pretty big issue, and we know how it affects people in this really fundamental way. So that's how we think about our work, is really energy as a tool for impact. How can we use the resources that we have to tackle Philadelphia's biggest challenges? And you'll note that climate change isn't on here, but that doesn't mean that's not front and center. I think the history of environmental justice issues across the country are super stark here in Philadelphia. Until fairly recently, we had the East Coast's largest oil refinery situated right on the fence line of a low-income, primarily Black neighborhood, and recently shut down because of an explosion that made it unsafe to continue operations, which is lucky for us air quality-wise, although perhaps there are other factors there that people want to talk about. But we really think about our work in terms of economic development, job creation, poverty reduction, and improving public health. I'm not going to run through all the details on this slide, but I want to share with you our sort of fundamental platform. So I should say the Philadelphia Energy Authority is a municipal government entity. We were created back in 2011 to support the city on energy affordability and sustainability. In 2016, we launched what is now our marquee initiative, really with the leadership of our city council president, Darrell Clark. It's called the Philadelphia Energy Campaign. Marketing is not my forte. And it's a 10-year investment or 10-year commitment to invest $1 billion in energy efficiency and clean energy projects in order to create 10,000 jobs. And in the first 3 years of the initiative, we've been able to launch over $136 million in projects, create over 1,300 jobs. So we're well on the way. These projects take a little bit of time to get rolling, so we're confident that we'll hit our goals by 2026. I wanted to just share a couple of highlights with the work we do. We hold long-term energy contracts on behalf of the city, so we've had a couple of great instances of that in the last few years. We signed the biggest solar PPA in the state. A 70 megawatt solar array is being built out by Gettysburg to provide 22% of the city's electricity. We recently did a couple of major energy efficiency performance contracts with the Philadelphia Museum of Art and with a number of schools in the Philadelphia School District. I just want to note there, that's a huge opportunity to address some of the capital needs that they have. So in addition to things like lighting, we're also doing harder measures like boilers and new windows. And we have 6 schools under contract with another 5 pending. We've done $10 million of residential rooftop solar through our Solarize Philly program, which I'll talk about in just a second. But I want to highlight that number because it was very hard fought. It's $10 million in little 4 kilowatt increments. If you can imagine the size of a Philadelphia row house rooftop. So we're really proud of that. And then I could talk on and on about some of these other ones, but we'll keep moving for expedience. So the first thing the first program I just want to highlight is our solar training program, Bright Solar Futures. And to tell you about that, I have to tell you about Solarize Philly. It's a discount program that we run to encourage residential solar adoption across the city. We're in the 4th round right now. These numbers are even a little bit bigger. We've signed over 700 contracts across the city. We're the largest project anywhere. And I think that's because we've been sort of consistently working hard to sort of build this. We've contracted over 3 megawatts now of solar, and as I mentioned, that $10 million number, and created almost 100 jobs. So keep that in the back of your mind. So we use revenue from Solarize Philly to help us fund a training program. And that's really how all of our programming works. We think about creating demand for employment and then making sure we have the skilled labor force to fill those jobs. And so we were able to get a grant from the US Department of Energy to help us start this up. There's 2 tracks to Bright Solar Futures. One is for opportunity youth, age 18 to 30. These are folks that are or underemployed, may have something in their background that's prevented them from being able to get, gainful living wage employment. Some have criminal records. So this is a training program where they're spending their second half of their Power Core PHL year with us, getting intensive solar training plus a summer internship. There's some really interesting issues around transportation equity that I'd love to talk about another time. But that was something that we really ran into that was a barrier. So we paid for all of them to take driver's ed and make sure they have their driver's licenses, which is often needed for jobs in the building trades. And then the other track is in the high school. So we were able to establish Pennsylvania's first career and technical education program in solar. And now there's funding available for any district statewide that wants to offer this curriculum, and we're happy to share it. Our first class just started. It's 10th graders, so they have a 3-year program with 2 internships plus career placement or going straight into higher ed. We're housed at Frankfurt High School. If anybody knows that part of the city, it's super transit accessible. It's a pretty diverse community, and it's 100% eligible for free school lunch. So it's really targeting the universe that we're hoping to target. I just love this picture and really wanted to share it. This is from Conduit Bending Day. This is right before we had to go online for COVID. But this is our Power Core PHL Fellows cohort. I wanted to just mention our curriculum includes not just solar installation, but also includes electricity basics, weatherization, energy efficiency. Our goal is to make sure there's a diversity of career paths for these students to make sure they actually are gainfully employed coming right out of the program. And we partner with the building trades, we partner with utilities, et cetera. And then I just want to mention sort of training begets training. So because we were able to establish Solarize Philly and create this demand, not only are we training young people, but we've been able to support the development of 2 other training labs, one at OIC Philadelphia and the other at the Energy Coordinating Agency. They're focusing on adults and returning citizens. So the sort of capacity for training has grown a lot. We all meet quarterly to make sure we're sort of sizing training appropriately for the size of the market. And we have an occupational advisory committee that it includes over 20 different folks that are in the industry that would actually be hiring people, and they help us shape our curriculum. Sarah, am I doing okay on time?
Yep, you have a couple minutes maybe. Beautiful.
Okay, I'll be quick about the second thing. The second thing I just want to tell you about is our Built to Last program. And I want to share these both with you because I think these are the 2 ways that we're able to think about how we shift the landscape to allow for more equitable clean energy adoption. And so the first is training, and the second is housing restoration. In Philadelphia, there's over 60,000 low-income owner-occupied homes, and many are generational. So unlike in Connecticut, we have a 41% homeownership rate in Philadelphia, historically high. It's kind of slumped a bit in years, but a lot of that is generational homeownership, where the home's been handed down, from family, and often there are pretty poor housing conditions. There's a lack of long-term maintenance. I think that is very common among aging housing stock and among low-income ownership. And it's contributed to really a host of problems, from energy insecurity to negative health outcomes. And I keep this picture on here because this is a home in Southwest Philadelphia that is occupied and has been for generations. And this home actually received a really great city service, which was to replace the roof at no cost to the homeowner. But you can see there's moldy insulation there that wasn't then repaired or replaced. You know, and like this is kind of the condition that folks are living in. So, and this is not even a bad example. I mean, I think this is a really common situation. And so there's all these different programs at the state, local, and federal levels that are bringing dollars into these issues. You often hear Congress people talking about weatherization, but there's no program coordination or very little program coordination. I don't want to say no, because there are a lot of nonprofits trying very hard to make this work. And so I think the outcome is that we're sort of maintaining poverty rather than reducing poverty. And I'm stealing that from one of my heroes, Dave Griffith, who runs Episcopal Community Services here. And we think about this all the time. How can we fundamentally solve problems so that we're changing the situation? So that's our goal, is to stabilize homes so that they are affordable, healthy, and safe for the long term. So this is the platform we built, and apologies for being kind of like a government technocrat. This is like our nerdy, you know, answer to this very challenging problem, which is this administrative backbone. So it Built to Last has 3 components. The first is a benefits screening that integrates the 20+ programs that are available in Philadelphia and lets you apply easily in one way. The second is a holistic property assessment. So we're doing 1, maybe 2 audits rather than doing 15 different audits for each program. And then the third is construction management. And you just would not believe how long it can take to get people services in the city. You know, one of our emergency programs has a 5-year waiting list. And that's for an emergency. So, so this is a way for us to put everything together and deliver services in a matter of weeks, not months or years. This is kind of the setup, and I wanted to share the slide because the money exists for the most part, right? This is not a whole new pot of funds that we need to invent. We're already spending 70 to 80% of the cost of all repairs that are needed for these homes among these different programs. We're just spending them in different places instead of putting them all together and layering and coordinating to make sure that everything works together. And the best quote I have on this is an executive at PECO once, which is our electric utility here, said at a conference, you know, our low-income weatherization programs and energy efficiency programs are great, but we'll walk into somebody's house and they'll have literally a hole in the roof, and we like walk in, change their light bulbs, and leave. You know, so so that's the problem we're fixing here. So we'll layer these programs together. We'll add that final layer of funding to get at the things that that are not covered by something else. And importantly, we're looking at adding electrification and solar. And the most important reason for us to do that is to create long-term affordability. And that is the thing that we believe will prevent displacement from gentrification. In Philly, sometimes folks, you know, sort of bend to developers who come to want to buy their home and develop it into something else because it seems like a lot of money, and the house is an albatross, not something that provides generational wealth. And so we are really excited to include solar there, and I think the solar industry has a big role to play to help us out. And I want to just end with this bit, which is that this is not a small problem. You know, just to even reach 10,000 of those homes, we have to invest $250 million. So I say this just to say this is not something that we will fix through philanthropy. It's not something that we're going to fix through, you know, just city dollars or just even federal dollars that have really narrow scopes. We need to get creative and find new ways to fund this and really integrate this into the diversity, equity, and inclusion and justice commitments that corporations are making now, and really build those partnerships. So I'll leave you with that.
Emily, thank you so much. That was great. And you can see from the questions and comments in the chat that other people are inspired by the example. As Jason shares his screen, I just wanted to ask you a question in the chat, which is a short one, which is, where did the initial funding for this how did the initial funding for this program come about, particularly the energy campaign that you started with?
Yeah, that's my favorite question. People always say, where's the $1 billion? And surprise, there was no $1 billion. You know, I think that's actually been the best part of this initiative, is that we're not New York, We're not California, right? We don't have the ability to sort of, throw a ton of money at this. And so we made a pledge to invest $1 billion, and the way we're doing it is to design programs that can be financed or that can pay for themselves. And so that's what we've been able to do so far for, $140 million of projects. And, we've got another 150 million on the way. So it's possible. I think that's the beauty of clean energy.
Great. Thank you so much. And with that, we will turn to Jason Carney, who's presenting from Tennessee. I think that's where you're located right now. You heard a little bit about his background, but I encourage you to Google him. And the first thing that comes up is a great story about how he got involved in this industry in the first place. And it really involves his journey to try to get a rooftop solar system on his own property. And so I'll turn it over to you, but with that introduction to just say, the story of how you came into this work and into this field is pretty incredible. So encourage others to take a look. So Jason, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sarah. And I appreciate being invited onto this panel and with the other great panelists I've had a chance to talk with. And I'll talk a little bit about my story, but it's hard to do that because that could go on forever. So I'll kind of get specific to a portion of my story that talks about getting solar to African-American communities. So again, thank you for having me on. I want to start by talking, providing kind of a theme and saying a shadow, caste over residential solar was my first slide. And to define a caste, I'm really infatuated with a book called Caste right now that, gives a lot of great context to the current environment that we have, especially as Emily mentioned, the verdict from yesterday from the Attorney General in Kentucky's verdict. But that's also a good welcome to the South type moment as well. But so caste, according to this book, is an artificial construction, a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste. We'll talk a little more about that in the presentation, but just to give you a little bit more about me, I'm a native Nashvilleian, mechanical engineering in my undergrad, in civic leadership as a graduate study, which kind of crystallized a lot of my efforts in that program, leading to the project I'll talk to you about. But basically, energy and faith, though that's my thing. If you look at the certifications and the work that I do, it's around a lot of energy, and I'm definitely in the community trying to inspire. So back to the caste. The dominant caste in Tennessee and in 6 other states, 7 states total, is the Tennessee Valley Authority. If you're not familiar with the TVA, it's the nation's largest public power utility. It sends power to, as I said, 95% of Tennessee, large portions of Mississippi and Alabama, Kentucky, North Carolina. It touches a lot, and so it's the very largest. And it is a federal agent, and so it is definitely dominant. There is no public utility commission, so there is really no recourse for individual homeowners or business owners to make changes. It has to be done kind of up the ladder, and a board of the TVA is appointed by the President of the United States. So as I often tell folks, it's literally an act of Congress to get them to move or change anything. You may have heard in the news recently that President Trump went and just, gutted out 3 board members, almost instantly. So, you see it, if you have to do anything, it has to happen at that level. But to give a little bit more background on TVA, I like to give the history. It was started in the 30s, 1933, from the FDR administration out of the New Deal to try to electrify the South, give rural and poor people in the Tennessee Valley jobs, and to also be able to electrify and light up these very, very, dark places. 1893 is when the Chicago World's Fair was happening, and Tesla and Edison were battling over how to do long distance transmission of electricity. And as I like to say, 40 years later, Tennessee Valley is using that technology to improve the lives of people in the Tennessee Valley. So the ironic thing is now solar is that new technology that needs to be used, but they're 80 years old and very much stodgy and don't want to take advantage of that new technology as they did previously, using renewable energy like hydroelectricity and things like that. So they're the dominant caste that cast the shadow over residential solar. Here are some of what that artificial construction, I mean, none of this is based in actual real need or survey of the people. This is just what their policies have created. So in the Southeast, this group, Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, which I worked with briefly, has come up with a metric called watts per customer. And so in the Southeast, the average is 325 watts per customer, solar PV watts per customer. The Tennessee Valley Authority, as you can see, is way below the average. And they don't even project to do any better. They actually project to continue to fall, even into 2023. So they're very political in that they talk a lot about having the lowest rates, but we don't pay rates, we pay bills. And so on top of these low rates are a lot of different fees that make energy burden an issue in the South and in the Tennessee Valley. And another thing that they talk about with regard to solar is that they're doing a lot of megawatts of solar, but this is exaggerated and it's misleading, because as you just said, as I just showed, it's projected that they will continue to fall behind the average in the leaders in the South. More artificial construction is in this solar policy that they had. So many years ago, they paid an incentive for the solar that you produced. You interconnect it to the grid, and residential solar is such that when the sun is producing the most energy pre-COVID is when you were needing the least amount of energy. You were gone to work or to school, and the sun is at its peak and it's making a ton of energy. There's no washer and dryer going, there's no dishwasher going or lights on. So it's making all its power. And so most utilities, worked with you to buy back some of that electricity that was being pushed onto the grid. And so years ago, when solar was really expensive, they said, okay, most people can't afford this anyway, so we're going to do a great PR move by putting a premium on top of the retail rate. So if the retail rate was 10.5 cents or 10 cents, they would pay you 22 cents, or even previous to 2012, 25 cents for the electricity, each kilowatt that you pushed back onto the grid. So then that took, as I guess the Sunshine Initiative started to take hold and cost of solar was going down and more people started to adopt solar. They saw that it was spreading, and then they started to pull away this incentive. Again, not really based on any need of the people or any really factual backgrounds, any academic study, but just their own artificial construction of solar policy. So in 2017, it goes down to nothing, which is essentially net metering. And then at the end of last year, they've completely wiped away the residential program. So what they've kind of done effectively is said, you're going to have a battery if you are going to put solar on your home. Because again, if you put solar on your home and then you're not home, you're going to push that electricity back onto our grid, and we're going to get it for free because we're not paying for it. And then we're going to sell it to your neighbor. So when, as a solar installer, and when you make that pitch, you now have to say, hey, you're going to have to get batteries with that, which if you were already stretching yourself to get solar, now you've got to add another $15,000 to $20,000 on top of that. And again, that creates, it's bad policy, and it creates a lack. All the mom and pops have gone, and there's really not a robust solar market in Tennessee Valley. This is a chart of Nashville's residential solar adoption. And so you can kind of see it tracks along with that policy that was created, that around 2012, when it started to pull the incentive, the number of systems started to decline year over year. And that, again, continues to kind of be the case. And we're also seeing the ITC is starting to drop in its incentive too. So it is definitely bad policy from my perspective, and just something that people need to be aware of. This is also kind of the results of this bad policy. In 2015, when we looked at the Solar Foundation job census, there was 0% of African Americans in the study. Whether or not that was a rounding error or some type of miscommunication, I think that it still speaks to the idea that there was enough that a rounding error could be zero. And we see 4 years later that it's still not representative of 28% of the state is African American, and still very low numbers. So along with what Dr. Sunter talked about, we see that even when controlling for income and homeownership, African Americans do not adopt solar at the same rate. So on the employment side and on the adoption side, you just don't see our participation in adoption of solar, and that's kind of the impetus for a lot of the work that I do. Also along with this, what good solar policy could do is help with energy burden, and solar can help with energy burden. So recently, ACE just put out a study saying that 36% of Black households experience a high energy burden. And what that looks like here is the zip code that I live in, 37207, has the city's highest energy burden. The adjacent zip code is the nation's most incarcerated. So I think the Solar Foundation also talks about solar being a job-creating powerhouse, and it creates jobs 4 times of the national average. So better policy could address energy burden as well as employment, because we know that a lot of poverty leads to crime, and a lot of poverty is from lack of employment. And both of those zip codes would probably be categorized as majority Black. And then Memphis, in a previous ACEEE report, has the nation's highest energy burden. So again, there may be low rates, but then how does Memphis end up having the highest energy burden? One, we know that, as was said previously, cost of living and incomes are different around the country, but that percentage still rings true. If the cost of your electricity or your energy is more than 6% or higher, it's a burden, and that needs to be understood, and policy should be changed to reflect that, to alleviate some of that energy burden. So from the bad news, we move to kind of, the good news, some of the things that I'm doing, and I'm calling this section Lifting the Shadows. And this Lifting the Shadow, and this is WCHS, stands for Whites Creek High School. In graduate school, my thesis was connecting the African American community to the green economy through solar energy. So the thought was there's all these jobs and there's all this opportunity within the green economy, but how do we, move these people that need jobs to this economy? Because I have theorized and believed that it's more than just jobs. Jobs are fickle. They move with the market, and we are typically, last hired, first fired as African Americans and as people of color. And as I like to now say with the book, the lower caste. And an economy, though, shrinks and expands, and you don't get thrown out, but you just have to manage as it goes through its cycles. So I think an economy, a green economy, is great. And I have such a passion for solar because I think it's very, very difficult to get into the energy energy industry, because it takes millions of dollars to get in, whereas the sun is right there, the wind is right there, and you just need to know how to capture it and manage it and manipulate it to get energy and to create jobs in an economy. So the idea was first community solar. First, it was individual solar, and we saw that was still too pricey for many people. So then the idea was community solar, the idea of aggregating. I call it the Costco or Sam's Club model for solar. If you buy in bigger bulk, you drop the price and economies of scale take over, and you can lower the entry point. And that's what I think it's all about, lowering the entry point of cost for people. So once we landed on community solar, then we thought, well, we've got to educate people. People don't even know what solar is, solar PV. I've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of solar equipment in North Carolina in a rural area where my wife's family lives, and it's not even fenced up. And I think the people that put it there said, well, no one even knows what this is, so they're not going to steal it. So we have to educate. So the school has a.
And Jason, let me just interrupt you. If you have, I know you have a bunch more slides, but you have maybe 1 or 2 minutes in your time. Maybe we can count for some of it in Q&A.
Gotcha. Okay. So the idea was if we can educate, then we can begin the process of starting to lift the shadow. So a lot of the other stuff is pictures and graphs. So we should be able to follow this pretty quickly. This is the process. We got a donation of panels. We started to bring in folks to teach the kids, professionals in the industry, took them to some sites to learn more about installations. And then we started to get them to design. They had to design and construct. They did everything but things they weren't certified to do. You can see that happening here. And then we got into the actual construction, got an assist from the ROTC group at the high school with moving things around. And then here comes kind of the substructure that students built and I helped assist with put in place. And this is the final result, which is there at the high school right now. And it got a good number of media hits, NPR being one of them. And then also what I do with energy electives and TSEA is energy efficiency work, solar PV, and advocacy, things like I'm doing right now. So keeps me pretty busy. And as was said before, we're getting a lot of requests in this environment for advocacy work. Here's some of the publications that talk about the work that I've done, and NPR being a great one. I think she referenced Dr. Sunter's work in the NPR piece. And I think allowing the sun to shine would be better policy. PACE legislation, community solar, pays or pay as you save financing, which is basically no money down type financing. Rounded up, which is also a way of aggregating small funds to help low-income folks, and the Green New Deal. And I think the Green New Deal is important because a lot of these things don't point to the actual group that needs the actual help. It's not intentional, so it can be missed. And the Green New Deal is actually more than just the renewable energy and sustainability, but it's also talking about communities of color being targeted for that work. So to somewhat close, a quote also from the book, "In a world without caste, we would all be invested in the well-being of others, in our species, if only for our own survival, and recognize that we are in need of each other more than we've been led to believe." And with that, I'll close, and hopefully didn't take up too much of your time.
No, that was great. Thank you so much, Jason. And I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen, and so we can maybe see all of the panelists as we move into the Q&A period. So it's interesting that all of the presentations focus primarily on distributed generation. So a small scale, whether it's a rooftop solar. Jason, you touched on community energy. And I really think of that as neighborhood scale or maybe block scale energy. And by and large, that's prohibited in most states. In Hartford, we're trying to reverse that at our state capital. They've done a small pilot program, but it's largely unavailable to most people. Then there's the question of the grid scale. So these large scale solar installations that are built outside of cities, leading to what I've called, or what others have called, and I agree, is energy sprawl. Which level of provision of access to clean energy is actually the most equitable? Is it distributed generation? Is it community scale? Is it the utility scale? I'm going to throw it out to maybe back to Jason first and see if he's willing to take that question on, and then I'll turn to Deborah.
I'll quickly just say that from my perspective, if it's equitable, then it involves the people that need it the most. And unless you are able to transport the workforce out into these remote rural areas where they can do the work, then it misses them. So I personally think that distributed community solar, more things that can be fit within metropolitan areas, which have more space than we sometimes like to think for solar. I think that's the most equitable.
Great. Deborah, you focus too on distributed generation. What is that really what we should be focusing on, or is there something that's unique about having solar or wind or fuel cells on site?
Yeah, well, I think this question is a bit complicated to ask. So I have research at both scales, both distributed and central. And with centralized, like large central power plants that are clean, like large solar farms, you do get economies of scale, and energy itself can be much cheaper as opposed to distributed systems. So it's quite complicated because there's a ton of injustice when it comes to pollution, such as the fact that I gave about the coal-fired power plants. And if you're able to replace those with large-scale solar plants, then that can be increasing equity. But another important metric of this equity is looking at financial benefits. And distributed energy sources such as solar, like rooftop solar, those economic benefits go to the household. Whereas when you have these larger scale systems, the equity is in that the cost of energy can overall go down, but that doesn't necessarily target specific communities. So I don't necessarily think that, I would not be an advocate for either system exclusively. I don't think the only way forward is large centralized power plants, nor do I think it's all 100% distributed. I think there's so many different metrics we have to balance, and we have to balance equity, cost, environmental impact. And another really important one is resiliency, like how reliable is the grid? And so I think the balancing of all these factors have to come into play. And I think the ultimate solution will be this smart system that has multiple scale generation.
Thank you. And Emily, picking up on that, I know that community energy has been considered in Pennsylvania. Do you have some thoughts about the viability of that from a maybe political perspective?
Sure. I love talking about a political perspective in Pennsylvania. yes, there is community solar legislation being considered in the state legislature. I don't think that I have any great understanding of why it hasn't moved forward yet. It's been a long, drawn out discussion. The utilities are not on the same page as the low income advocates, who are not on the same page as the solar advocates, as to what it should look like. And in Pennsylvania, we have what can only be described as a paltry amount of solar. And so, you know, the concerns that I think are being expressed, particularly from the industry side, are concerns that truly just do not apply for the amount of solar that we currently have on the grid, and the amount that is being contemplated under our community solar legislation. That said, you're not allowed in Pennsylvania now, or really under that legislation either, to put solar on the rooftop of a low-income multifamily building and have it benefit the residents of that building. And so we believe that there is a lot of room for improvement on the legislative and regulatory side here in Pennsylvania. And, you know, we operate under the under the philosophy that we don't wait for Harrisburg or for the federal government to solve our problems, because we're not going to hold our breath. We're going to, you know, go forward with what we have access to now. And Philadelphia has tons of incredible rooftops for solar, and we believe that it should be accessible to everyone. So we've moved forward with distributed generation as well, and have been able to partner on some things with our local utility for that, and oppose each other on other things. But, you know, I think the most equitable thing is the thing that you get to have.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, let's talk a little bit more about the political dimensions here. So Jason, you mentioned politics a couple times in your remarks, and in a lot of ways, politics, or maybe just lack of education by politicians in this somewhat technical area, are often barriers to achieving full equity in clean energy. Maybe I'll kick it back over to you, Emily, and ask, you know, in your case, is this a big city versus Harrisburg dynamic that you're seeing? And then, because I know we'll all be able to talk about this for hours, I want to have another targeted question for Deborah. And then for Deborah, I want to ask, did you see differences between Democrats and Republicans in your survey? But first, Emily, go ahead.
I think that folks all across Pennsylvania are interested in solar and see the local economic benefits of solar. I think a good example of that actually is, you know, we signed this power purchase agreement for a 70 megawatt array that's being built in Adams County, Pennsylvania, which is truly, you know, about as far away from the city as it gets, right? Theoretically, right? Not distance-wise, but philosophically, perhaps. And, you know, as part of that agreement with our developer, the city of Philadelphia wants to create economic value, both for the location that it's in and for us. And so we created a sort of substitute prevailing wage so that Philadelphia contractors could be competitive with folks out in Adams County, who frankly, there are just not a lot of solar contractors out there. So, you know, we've developed a training program that we can literally transplant into Adams County school districts that might want them, so that they will get to work on these projects. So, you know, I think maybe the reasons are different in different parts of the state, but I think there's a huge amount of support for solar among voters, whether Democrats or Republican in Pennsylvania, maybe for energy independence, maybe for control of your own systems, you know, controlling your own destiny a bit. But the politicians don't reflect that. So for whatever reason.
Great. Deborah, you want to weigh in on any sort of party-related demographics that you may have collected in your work?
Yes, absolutely. So in the study that I presented today, we didn't look for political affiliation. However, I have a second study that I did where I looked specifically at Texas as a very red state and New York as a very blue state. And I looked at the role of political affiliation in those two states and how it relates to rooftop solar adoption. And what we first found is that as census tracts had a higher percentage of Republican registered voters, the more rooftop solar they would adopt. However, Republicans are historically wealthier, and we've already seen that there's a really strong correlation between wealth and rooftop solar. And so what we did is we performed the lowest method, which is the same method that was applied in the study I presented today. And that basically showed that in Texas, after you correct for wealth, there's no statistically significant difference between Republican versus Democratic installation. However, in New York, even after correcting for income, there was still a disparity. And it was somewhat surprising because it was Republicans that were installing more. And so I do think that this actually opens up an interesting dialogue about this perceived idea that renewable energy is partisan, and that you'll have certain communities that stereotypically you'd assume like, oh, it's the liberals, they're the ones who care about the environment, they're the ones who are installing rooftop solar. But that's not the case at all. You have to recognize that people's motivation for putting on solar can vary a lot, but there are good reasons for both parties that align well with their historical principles. So solar does offer a lot of economic benefits to those who install it. So the economic benefits, the benefits to the environment, the benefits to society are all very clear. And I think we should recognize that as a country, we want to participate, and it's not, and sometimes the politicians want to turn us into a very divided country. But the reality is I think we're actually much more together and unified in this quest for for solar energy and for a cleaner environment for us all.
Great, thank you. Jason, I want to turn back to you. And again, what I'm trying to do with the questions in the chat is pull out some themes and you know, in our very short time, try to get as many of them out. We did get a question for you, Jason, about the financial dimension when it comes to jobs. So you mentioned creating that these, all of you mentioned how these programs can create jobs for people. And one of the questions was, what kinds of jobs do we want to create through the expansion of clean energy access? Is it the low-skilled installation jobs versus the, there's a mention of leadership, engineering, you know, type jobs, or do we want all? Maybe you can speak to that. What kind of jobs are we creating through these programs?
Yeah, so when I'm at the high school and I'm talking to the students about, you know, jobs that are possible, I'm not putting any limitations on it. I think that, again, I'm talking about moving folks into a whole different economy and not just a specific job, but looking, you know, even just at no matter what you do and having a sustainable edge to, you know, if you're a firefighter, making sure your fire hall has, you know, insulated and is using as little electricity as possible. But yeah, I'm talking to the students about if you are a hands-on type person, then, you know, getting your OSHA certification, getting NABCEP certification, and being an installer. But if you're, you know, science-based, we still need to improve the efficiency of solar panels, and people are doing it. So go to a four-year college and get into chemistry and go that route. If you're a marketing person, we need a lot more education and sales. So I just think there is a whole, again, economy out there in solar and the green economy overall that I try to talk about. And that way I don't make anyone feel like that's not me, that's not for me. I think it's for you. And you just have to find what your talents are and what you want to do.
Great, and it sounds like, you know, Philly has a program with high school students too. That's always hopeful, I know, to work with students. I guess that's why I'm a professor. Question for Emily too about wealth building. So we had a couple of questions about your program and about the possibility that homeowners who participate in your program might be able to build wealth through their program and in a way avoid foreclosures. And one of the individuals who asked pointed out that probably there are many urban heads of household that are women in Philadelphia. So I was wondering if you could speak to that issue.
Definitely. And, you know, I think that is really at the core of the work we're doing, you know, for families who have been able to maintain their homes and then pass that home on to the next generation. You know, you've created a stable foundation for that next generation. And in fact, we even see in Philadelphia, Habitat for Humanity has great stats on this. They have a critical home repair program. And really often they see that once they fix up a home, tons of other relatives move in. They call it the life raft life raft principle that, you know, as soon as a home is in good shape, it creates an environment that other family members can thrive as well. And so we know that if you can give folks that stable foundation, it does build that generational wealth. And what we're seeing is that just hasn't been happening in Philadelphia, right? I mean, you know, folks will get a piece of the puzzle solved, but the home is still so energy inefficient that their utility bills are out of control, or, you know, it's not warm. I mean, you know, truly and sadly in Philadelphia every year, a handful of folks die in the winter from hypothermia inside of their own homes every year. And, you know, these are problems that we can solve. And so, yeah, generational wealth is something we think about deeply. Household wealth is something we think about all the time. And so we've developed these programs to try to provide a mix of sort of, you know, as many grants as possible, but also some creative finance, you know, forgivable loans, those kinds of things to make sure that we're allowing that home and supporting that home to build wealth through that in the same way that people of higher incomes get to do all the time.
Thank you. You know, that kind of leads to the last set of questions, and I'll have all of you respond to this. And that's the question of really big picture. How do we scale up the financing side of this? So if so much money is needed just for Philadelphia alone, you know, how do we take this to a national scale? Here in Connecticut, we have a green bank that we work with in Hartford a lot. They've really pioneered the concept of you invest once in the green bank and it's kind of a revolving fund for an array of projects. And in fact, our green bank sponsored our Solar for All program here in Hartford. So I guess I'm just wondering, I'll, you know, turn to all three of you, maybe starting with Emily, because I see you most vigorously nodding your head, and then going to Deborah, and we'll give Jason the last word. What are the options for big picture financing for the kinds of changes that we need to see to really bring equity into the clean energy economy?
So I'll start with that we are launching Philadelphia Green Bank as well, starting in early 2021, very deeply modeled on a lot of the programs that the Connecticut Green Bank has. So we're grateful for their leadership. And same thing, you know, we believe it's not really possible in the existing financial infrastructure to scale up financing in a way that eliminates a lot of those racial barriers that have been put in place over you know, decades through systems. So that's one component of it. I think, to be honest, another component is that we have to redistribute some of the wealth that's out there. And I think big corporations, as they're thinking about you know, making the transition to clean energy, need to be thinking about how that affects the communities that they live and work in and serve. And so we've actually proposed to the solar industry that we create an equity and access fee that we can attach to utility scale solar projects, or even, you know, smaller scale projects as well. You know, that doesn't have to be a huge impact to the financials of the project, but would direct some funding on an ongoing basis to programs like ours that do serve these communities. And then I think really the last thing is, you know, we need utilities and gas companies and, you know, everybody to sort of get on the same page about the urgency of climate change and the urgency of equitable adaptation. You know, we can't do this the way we've been doing it, and everybody has to be, you know, not just making pledges, but they need to be substantively and deeply engaged in changing the system.
Thank you. Deborah.
Yes, so I agree with many of the things that Emily just said, and I'd like to echo a few more. So I do think that we are entering a new time where I think the effects of energy insecurity and the costs of climate change are really enormous. And I think not only is the cost of these renewable technologies coming down, but their net benefit is all that much more for society. And I do think that this is a place where we really do need government involvement to support policies and incentive structures to help aid the adoption of these policies. I think the Connecticut Green Bank is an outstanding example, and I've been really honored to be able to work with them. And I particularly like how they're very reflective of their policies, and they actually go back and they look at how has their policies affected different demographics by income, by home ownership, by race and ethnicity. And I think this level of deep evaluation of policies is really important. And I worry that some policies are very short-lived and changing quite rapidly. And I'm working on a study right now that actually shows that most solar policies take about 3 years before their full effects are shown. And yet I feel like some of these policies are sunsetting too quickly before they're able to actually show their benefit to penetration. So I do think a really mindfulness in all of our policies and all of our incentive programs is really what I think is most critical to ensure that everything that we're doing is equitable and just.
And Jason, I'll give you the last word on the finance question, and I'll close with a couple of remarks.
Two things. One, and I'll say a little bit different than what Emily said, because in the South, that redistribution of wealth is tough to say. So I'll say it this way, and it's somewhat shamelessly: use African-American companies that do this work. And if someone at the executive level, governor, mayor, or president, can create a program that incentivizes people to do that, I think then you'll see not only those companies are connected to communities and families, and that will naturally be educated and will create a groundswell. So I would say that, and then two, as someone who has just seen us go into this COVID environment and do all of this, whether you call it quantitative easing or stimulus or whatever it is, we all recognize there's money somewhere, so getting away from the idea that there's not enough money is something that I don't think most common people like myself want to hear. There's money out there to do this. So we just need political will. And that's something that Dr. Mark Jacobson talks about with his wind, water, solar initiative. He thinks we can, he's got studies out there that says we can do the whole country with solar, wind, and water. And whoever is the president needs to, have someone like him, Dr. Robert Bullard, and others that are experts at this, Dr. Sunter, that can come and talk about and create policy that will create these financial incentives that we need. So I think, on today, support African-American businesses and other businesses of color that are in renewable energy. But then, put people in that really want to create cabinets that care about this stuff.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you for giving us quite a reading list through your presentation and your comments. I hope everybody's been taking notes, and I do see more questions in the chat, particularly about transportation, an extremely important part of our clean energy future. Actually, you can hear a little bit more about transportation and creating energy efficient communities on the Kleinman Center's Energy Policy Now podcast that will be premiering on Tuesday. I'll be chatting with Andy Stone about that topic. But before we close, just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists. They've taken us from the national to the state to the local, from politics to finances to law. And I think that they've really helped to illuminate the issues that we're talking about through their work and also their personal stories. So thank you. I learned a lot, and I really, really appreciate it. So I'll just close by asking the audience a question, which is, what will you do, armed with the knowledge that you got today, to change our energy landscape to make it more equitable? You'll be able to find a recording of this discussion along with slides on the Kleinman Center website as of tomorrow. With that, I will sign off. Take care and have a wonderful afternoon. Bye-bye, everyone, and thank you.